Okay, welcome to another lesson. Today we're going to be looking at the power and influence of the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. It's really important to look at the Catholic Church and the power it had because it was by far the most influential and powerful organisation in Europe at the time. It influenced absolutely everybody in medieval Europe, from the lowest peasant to the highest king. Everyone was influenced by the Catholic Church. So today, our lesson objectives. Firstly, we want you to understand the importance of the church. We want you to understand how the church was structured in its hierarchy. We want you to understand how this relates to our driving question. How would you survive in medieval Europe? And we want you to understand some of the key terms that we'll be using throughout. Okay? As always, there are some questions that go along with it, so have a look at the questions and answer them as you go, or pause, or whatever you need to do. So, when we're talking about the Christian church in medieval Europe, it's important to remember that it was absolutely central to every aspect of life in the Middle Ages. Okay? So, in fact, the church on the manor around where people lived was quite literally central. Okay, in most manors, the church was in the centre of the town, of the area, so it was very central to the way people lived. From birth, with baptisms, marriages, funerals, everything, every aspect of your life, from your social life to your religious life, was pretty much based around the church. Okay, so it influenced every single last thing in your life. So it was extremely important. So we're going to look very quickly at the hierarchy of the church, but before we do that, we're just going to look at a couple of terms that are important to understand. And so hierarchy, we've used hierarchy a little bit. We've talked about it during the feudal system, obviously, and we've used it a lot. So what hierarchy means is basically it is the rank and order of importance within an organisation or a system. Okay, so there's differing levels of power. The powerful at the top, the least powerful down the bottom. Okay, so we use hierarchy a lot. We just need to make sure that everyone's understanding what we're talking about. Okay, the next one we're talking about is the clergy. Okay, you're going to hear that term used, clergy. And what clergy means is basically religious officials who work for the church. Okay, so it's important that you remember those two terms when they're used again, just so that you know what's happening. So looking at the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, at the top we have the Pope. Now the Pope holds supreme authority over the church, okay? He is the ruler, the leader of the church. He makes both religious decisions, so for example, what the church considers to be in line with Catholic teaching. And at the time, he also made political decisions, who the church decided to align with, which kings they decided to align with, and things like that. So the Pope was the supreme ruler of the Catholic Church. We're going to go to the bottom of the hierarchy now and just very quickly look at the parish priest. So you see that word there, parish? That means that the priest oversaw a parish, okay, which is basically one church in a town or a manor. And they conducted the church services in town and oversaw the church goings on within a town. So they oversaw a parish. Just above those, we have the bishops. So the bishops managed a group of parishes, and they oversaw a fair group of parishes. They were the overseers of that. And quite often in early feudalism, bishops were often feudal lords, so they were already quite high up in society. Just above the bishops, we have the archbishops. They, just like the bishops, oversaw a group of priests. The archbishops overarch a group of bishops, so they oversee a group of bishops. So you would the archbishop is just higher up than the bishop, and then the final level are the cardinals, and the cardinals are the Pope's advisors. So there's only a few cardinals, and they advise the Pope on different matters, and they also choose the Pope when a Pope dies and a new Pope needs to be selected. So the cardinals are very powerful as well, but just underneath the Pope. So, something important to note about the hierarchy of the church is that unlike in feudalism, you could work your way up in this system. In feudalism, if we remember, if you were born a peasant, you stayed a peasant. If you were born a lesser noble or a knight, that's what you stayed. Whereas in the church hierarchy, it is actually possible to work your way up. So if you were a parish priest, you worked really hard, you knew the right people, you might be able to work your way up to a bishop. Same with a bishop, you could work your way up to an archbishop. Again, if you knew the right people, you worked really hard, it is possible for you to work your way all the way up to being the pope, which again is very different from the feudal system where you couldn't work your way up. So you can see why this would be an appealing option for people who weren't of noble birth, of people, peasants or freeborn people who might wish to join the church in the chance of working their way up through society. So that is the hierarchy of the church. Why was the church so powerful in medieval Europe? Okay, why was it? What made it so powerful? So we're just going to look at a few different reasons why. Firstly, people in the Middle Ages were very religious. It's important to remember that. Every single person believed in God, in heaven, in hell, in the devil. They were very religious. And it was believed that the church, God's representative on earth, had the power to send people to heaven or to hell. So the fear of being sent to heaven or to hell and the power that that has over people, okay, that equals power. People are fearful that they could go to hell. The church is your way to heaven, so people listen to the church. That makes them very, very powerful. Secondly, when rich nobles died, many of them left their land to the church. And as we learnt in our feudalism lesson last week, in medieval Europe, if you had land, you had power. Land equals power. So that was also very, very important. That meant that the church actually became the largest owner of land in medieval Europe. So obviously an extremely powerful organisation. Thirdly, everybody was expected to pay tithes or taxes to the church, which meant they became very, very wealthy because they didn't have to pay taxes. They got taxes given to them, so they became very, very wealthy. And lastly, one of the reasons that they were so powerful is that the church really, in medieval times, were centres for learning. Often the clergy were the only ones who could read and write, which meant that influential people like kings, leaders, nobles, they often relied really heavily on church officials, on the clergy, to help them, to guide them, and to to help them out. And yeah, so that education equaled power. So everyday influences, everyday things that the Catholic Church did in medieval Europe. So with the exception of just a few groups, this very small communities of Jewish people in Europe, every person in Europe in the Middle Ages was a Roman Catholic. Okay, so that we're talking from the highest king to the lowest peasant. Everyone had to live by the laws of the church. Okay, they all had to pay taxes to the church. So it didn't matter if you were the king or a lowly peasant, you had to live by the rules of the church. In return, the church showed people the way to everlasting happiness or heaven. This is what the church gave you in return for your service. So they gave you the idea that you could reach heaven, okay? And after living very hard lives, this was very appealing to people, this idea that after living a really hard life as a peasant, as a labourer, they would be granted everlasting happiness in the afterlife. So it was a very appealing thing for people to follow the teachings of the church. So from just after birth, with baptism, people entered a life of service to God. They were taught prayers, they were expected to attend church, sometimes on a daily basis, and they had to live in accordance with the church laws. So whatever the church, whatever the Pope decided were the church laws, people had to live within that guide, like those laws, okay? So we're going to look right now at the powers of the church, okay? It's really important to remember that people felt that the church was their way into heaven. So these powers of the church will make more sense then. and how influential they were on people, if you remember that people thought this was the way into heaven. Okay, so firstly, the first and probably the most important power of the church was what we call excommunication. So excommunication means not allowing someone to be a member of the church. So this was like removing them from society as a whole. If all of society are members of the church and follow the teachings of the church, to remove them from this was a huge blow. They were removed from every aspect of life. Okay. Second was an interdict. Now, this meant this was like an excommunication on a larger scale. So it was closing of all the churches in a region and preventing priests from performing marriages, funerals, or other services. So this was, like I said, excommunicating a whole region, a larger group of people. And the way that the church investigated these sorts of things and made these decisions was called an inquisition. Okay, this was the attempt to get rid of any beliefs that did not align with the church's teachings. People had two choices. They could either reform and go with the church's teaching, or they were punished, tortured, and executed. Okay, so we're going to look at that. So crime and punishment if you didn't follow the church's teachings. Okay, so the worst thing in medieval Europe that you could be accused of was being a heretic, or you were accused of heresy. Okay, now here's a little definition for us. So heresy is denying or not believing in the teachings of the church. Okay, and the church decided if you were a heretic or that you were, you were not believing in their teachings. Okay, so what happened if you were a heretic? So if you were accused of heresy, you could face an inquisition, and if found guilty, you would be excommunicated, like we talked about. But there's a little bit more to it than that, okay? So during the medieval times, the Middle Ages, inflicting pain and torture was an accepted form of punishment or interrogation. So if they were trying to get to the bottom of whether you were a heretic or not, you could be tortured. And that could take on many different forms. So when an inquisition was being practiced, no torture methods were allowed that resulted in bloodshed. Okay, so they came up with a lot of different ways of torturing people. So a common form of torture, for example, was hanging the accused by their wrist, hoisted above the ground, and then having weights hung from their ankles. So this torture method was known as the Judas cradle, and you can imagine how painful that would be. The rules restricting bloodshed extended to the preferred execution method of those who were accused of heresy. So those who were proclaimed as heretics by the Inquisition were therefore burnt to death or burnt at the stake. So you may have heard that before. So like you can see there in the image, there's a lot of different ways that medieval torturers were able to torture people. So a skilled torturer would use methods, devices and instruments to prolong life as long as possible whilst inflicting agonising pain. The customs of the medieval period meant that prisoners were tortured before they were executed in order to get additional information about crimes and their accomplices. But as you can imagine, if you were being tortured, you would pretty much admit to anything to make the torture stop. So it's not the most accurate way of getting information, because people would admit to all sorts of things, including heresy, if it meant the torture would stop. Okay? So, how does this relate to our driving question, how would you survive in medieval Europe? Okay, so it's important for people, when we're looking at our how would you survive in medieval Europe, to understand that the church was central to every level of society. If you spoke out against the church or did something that they thought was against the teachings of the church, you could be labelled a heretic, which means you could be tortured and burned at the stake. So it's very important in A Guide to Survive that it's clear that the person must adhere to the teachings of the church, or torture could be in their future. Okay, so that's really important for the person who's reading your guide to understand that if they didn't follow the teachings of the church, then there could be a lot of issues come their way. Okay, so like I said, there's some questions there to do, so get into those. If you need anything, ask your teacher.